Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallama ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. Deductive inference with categorical syllogisms. We saw in the previous lesson when we studied kinds of arguments that arguments are either deductive or inductive. Deductive arguments are of two kinds and inductive arguments are also of two kinds. The difference between the two kinds of deductive arguments and the two kinds of inductive arguments is that deductive arguments entail their conclusions conclusively and inductive arguments entail their conclusions probabilistically. We saw also in the previous lesson that logicians generally focus on deductive arguments. So in this lesson, we're going to study the first kind of deductive argument, namely a categorical deductive argument, which in classical traditional terminology of logic is called a categorical syllogism. Syllogism is just a medieval word for argument. So categorical deductive arguments are of two kinds, because the categorical syllogism, the categorical argument, can either be composed purely of categorical propositions, or it can also have conditional propositions. Either it can be completely comprised of conditional propositions or partly of conditional and partly of categorical propositions. So what this illustrates is a categorical syllogism, although it's called a categorical syllogism, does not have to be composed only of categorical propositions. However, the most common examples of the categorical syllogism are composed of categorical propositions. So what we'll do in this lesson is we will focus on categorical arguments, categorical syllogisms that are composed purely of categorical propositions, and in the second part of this lesson we will return to consider categorical arguments that also have conditional propositions, and we'll be able to do that because we'll have a better understanding of what exactly a categorical argument is. So the goal of this lesson is to understand what exactly a categorical syllogism, a categorical deductive argument is, and we'll do that using categorical arguments that are composed purely of categorical propositions. Now I'm sure all of these are just big words that you feel are being thrown at you. Let's take a couple of examples and the big words will become clearer. So here's an example of a categorical argument, a categorical syllogism that is composed of categorical propositions. Let's put aside the terms minor premise, major premise, and conclusion for now. We'll return to them shortly in this lesson. Let's focus on the argument. So this argument, the first two propositions are the argument because their form entails a conclusion. Their form, what we mean by their form is that the way in which the subject and predicate of each proposition is composed. So we can abstract away the particular subject of the first proposition of the argument, U, and we can label it A. And we find that this first subject, the subject of the first proposition, A, also appears in the conclusion. We can take the predicate of the first proposition and abstract it away as B, and we find that the predicate of the first proposition of the argument is the subject of the second. And we can take the predicate of the second proposition and abstract it away as C, and we find that C also occurs in the conclusion. So the abstract form of this argument is A, B, B, C. And so A, B, B, C, this tells you the subject and predicate of the first proposition and the subject and predicate of the second proposition. It tells you that the first and second propositions share the term B. B is the predicate of the first proposition and the subject of the second. And the conclusion of this argument has the abstract form AC. A is taken from the first proposition and C is taken from the second proposition. This kind of argument is called a categorical argument, a categorical syllogism. A categorical syllogism is an argument in which the conclusion is taken partly from the first proposition and partly from the second proposition. So the conclusion here is of the form AC. A comes from the first proposition and C comes from the second. And there's something called a middle term, which we'll see shortly what exactly it means. Over here it's B, which is common to both propositions and which is discarded when we go to the conclusion. This is a categorical argument. This is a categorical syllogism. We'll see many more examples in this lesson, and inshallah you'll become familiarized with it. So this abstraction, the term A, B, and C are called the terms of the categorical syllogism. The terms of the categorical syllogism are the parts from which its propositions are composed. The Arabic term for term is had. Note that the term had in the science of logic was also used for essential definition, and essential definition is also called had, and the term of a proposition in a categorical argument is also called a had. So we have to be careful when we see the word had to distinguish between how it is being used. The plural of had is hudud. The form, the arrangement of the terms of the argument A, B, B, C, this is called the figure of the categorical syllogism, and we'll see shortly that the categorical syllogism can have 4 different figures, because the terms can be arranged A, B, B, C, or they could be arranged A, B, C, B, or they could be arranged B, A, B, C, or a 4th way. So the way in which the terms are arranged, that is called the figure of the categorical syllogism. It's an abstract way of looking at how the terms of the propositions are arranged, and we're not concerned with the particular meanings of those terms, the particular significations of those terms, because remember from the previous lesson, what we are studying here is the form. We're studying formal logic, the formal entailment of a conclusion. When the form of an argument entails the particular form of a conclusion, regardless of what the particular terms might actually be. So this is called the figure of the categorical syllogism. If we add the quantifiers and we add whether information about whether each proposition is affirmative or negative, so if we say all A is B, this is a universally quantified all affirmative proposition, is all A is B. No B is C, this is a universally quantified no negative proposition. No, there's no B that is C. So we're negating something. So when we add the quantifiers and the affirmation or negation to the abstract form of a figure, then that is called a mode of that figure. And every figure has 16 different modes. We'll see these very shortly. And this particular mode of the figure has a conclusion of the form no A is C. So if all A is B and no B is C, then the conclusion is that no A is C. So we have 3 things that we're going to be looking at in this lesson. We're going to be looking at terms, we're going to be looking at figures, and we're going to be looking at modes of those figures. And then we'll see, our goal is to arrive at knowledge of which modes of each figure have a conclusion and what exactly that conclusion is. So let's begin with the terms. So he says, so we saw that there's 3 terms, A, B, and C, and the logicians, they give each term a name. So Athiruddin al-Abhari, he says that the term that is repeated in both premises of the categorical syllogism is called the middle term. So we'll start with the middle term. So let's take this categorical syllogism. Our classic example, seen it many times. You cannot bring the sun from the west, anyone who cannot bring the sun from the west is not God. This is what we began this lesson with, and we've already seen that the abstract form of this argument is AB, BC. So the term that is repeated in both of these premises, so what is a premise? What's the difference between a premise and a proposition? A proposition is a statement that can be true or false. We had several lessons about the various kinds of propositions. When you put a proposition into an argument, that proposition is called a premise of the argument, because the argument depends on that proposition. So premise is a proposition within an argument. So these two propositions are called the premises of this categorical syllogism, this categorical argument. These two propositions have a common term, namely someone who cannot bring the sun from the west. This is represented in the abstraction as B, term B. This term is repeated in both premises. It's repeated in both propositions of the argument, and this is called the middle term. So the middle term is what enables inference in a categorical proposition. It is what connects the two propositions. If there was no middle term, then there would be no inference. So if we change the second proposition from anyone who cannot bring the sun from the west is not God to anyone who cannot create the universe is not God, the second proposition is a true proposition. The first proposition is a true proposition, but they have nothing in common. You cannot bring the sun from the west. Anyone who cannot create the universe is not God. You cannot come to a conclusion because there is no middle term. There is no common element between the two propositions. They're completely unrelated. In order for two propositions to entail a conclusion, they must have something in common. And in a categorical syllogism, that thing in common is the middle term. Without the middle term, there cannot be any inference. The middle term is used in the process of inference, but then it's discarded in the conclusion. Its role is merely to connect the two propositions. So if you look at the conclusion of this argument, there's the middle term B, which is the predicate of the first and the subject of the second proposition. You cannot bring the sun from the west. Anyone who cannot bring the sun from the west is God. Conclusion is, you are not God. There's no middle term. B is not there. The role of the middle term was simply to connect the two propositions, to enable inference, and it's discarded in the conclusion. So the middle term is extremely important in a categorical syllogism. So this is the middle term. Now, he says that there's also two other terms. So there's the A and the C, and these also have names. In order to understand their names, we need to look at the conclusion. So let's look at the conclusion, you are not God. The conclusion has terms A and C. So he says that the subject of the conclusion is called the minor term. So the subject of the conclusion is A. So A in the, where did it come from? It came from the first premise. The first premise has A. A in the first premise is called the minor term, U, because it's going to be the subject of the conclusion. And C is called the major term. What's the major term? The major term is the predicate of the conclusion. So the major term is in the second proposition, B, C, and anyone who cannot bring the sun from the west is not God. You are not God. That's the predicate of the conclusion. And so C is called the major term. So in any categorical syllogism, you're going to have a minor term, you're going to have a major term, and you're going to have a middle term. So from the minor and major terms, we get the names of the premises. The premise that contains the minor term, the first one here, is called the minor premise. And the premise that contains the major term is called the major premise. Why do these premises have these names? Why do these terms have these names? Why do we call them minor, major, middle? This is an exact translation of the Arabic. In Arabic, the minor term is called sughra, which means the smallest term. The major term is called kubra, which means the biggest term. And the middle term is called awsat, which means somewhere in between the biggest and the smallest. In order to understand why these terms get their names, we need to consider the affirmative form of the categorical proposition. So we're going to make all of the propositions affirmative. In our previous example, all of them were not affirmative. The second proposition was negative. Anyone who cannot bring the sun from the west is not God. That was a negative proposition. So we're going to change it to this proposition. You are not rational. Anyone who is rational is an animal. Therefore, you are an animal. And so we have our minor term, minor premise, major premise, and we have the conclusion. Now, let's go through these terms one by one. Let's take the minor term. So the minor term is you. So let's consider the scope of this term. The term you only applies to one individual. You are rational. Middle term. You are rational. The scope of rational things, the scope of this term, is wider than the scope of you, because you are rational. You are one instance, in other words, of a larger set of things that are rational. There are many things that are rational. There's only one thing that is you. And so we find that the minor term is less inclusive, is less expansive in its scope than the middle term. And similarly, the middle term, someone who is rational, is less expansive, less exclusive in scope than animal. Rational things are one kind of animal. There are human beings, in other words. There are many other kinds of animal that are not rational. And so we see that the scope of the minor term is small, the scope of the middle term is larger, and the scope of the major term is largest. And this is why they're called minor, middle, and major, because the scope of the minor term is minor, the scope of the middle term is middle, somewhere in the middle, and the scope of the major term is major, big. And that's why that's why in this case we can see that's why you have the conclusion, because what the middle term does is you basically, in the minor premise, it puts the minor term into the middle term, and then the major premise puts the middle term into the major term, and therefore the conclusion is that the minor term you is put inside the major term animal. That's how the inference process works, and that's why these terms have their names. Now this illustration only works for affirmative proposition. Only works for a categorical syllogism with affirmative propositions that have this particular form. If you change the propositions to negative or particularly quantified, or you can take, or even in this case, actually, even with an affirmative proposition, you can find examples where it's not exactly like this, and the scope of inclusion doesn't vary in this exact manner. But this is the clearest form of inference. This pattern of propositional inference of the categorical syllogism is the clearest, most easy to reason from, and it's seen as the logicians consider this as the classic example, the classic illustrative example of the categorical syllogism. And in this classic illustrative example, this is how the minor, middle, and major terms happen to be arranged, and this is the scope that they happen to have, and from this is where they get their names. And it's a good example to keep in mind, because it tells you how the inference process in these kinds of syllogisms works. You put the various terms into various other terms, and you can work out the conclusion based on the scope of each term, and whether it's wider or equal or narrower than the other terms, and then you look at what's being said and you place them inside each other, and then you get to the conclusion. In this example it's quite easy, but in other examples it can be quite mind-bending. and it's good. One of the goals of studying logic in a traditional Islamic studies curriculum is that it exercises the mind, and you're forced to think very carefully about how exactly an inference is made in the mind, and it sharpens your ability to and it gives you the ability to find mistakes, find flaws in reasoning, identify exactly how somebody is arguing, and it so it helps sometimes. So the particular example might not be very practical, but the process and thinking about how we think is a useful exercise, and it's one of the goals of studying the science of logic. So let's go back to our example. You cannot bring the sun from the west. Anyone who cannot bring the sun from the west is not God. Now, this example is different from the example that we just saw. It's different because the second premise is negative. However, it has the same form, A, B, B, C. And we say that they belong, these two, the argument that we just saw and the argument that you see on the slide here, are two different forms, two different modes of this figure. What's the figure? The figure is A, B, B, C. So what's a figure? He says that the compositional form of the premises in a categorical syllogism, in other words, is called the figure of the categorical syllogism. So what's the compositional form? It's the abstract way. You look abstractly at how the various terms of the premises are being composed. So A, B, B, C, this is the compositional form, and the categorical syllogism has 4 figures. Let's go through them one by one. He says that the first figure is when the middle term is the predicate of the minor premise and the subject of the major premise. So the middle term is B. In the minor premise, it's the predicate, the first one. In the major premise, it's the subject. The fourth figure is the opposite. So we basically switch the location of the middle term. The middle term, remember, is the term that's common to both premises. And so in the first figure, that term was the predicate of the first premise, subject of the second. In the fourth figure, it's the subject of the first and the predicate of the second. The second figure, or actually the third figure, that's what he does next. In the third figure, the middle term is the subject in both premises, BA, BC. And in the second figure, it's the predicate in both premises, AB, CB. These are the 4 forms of the 4 figures of the categorical syllogism. And we work out the figures by looking at the location of the middle term, the term that is common. So the position of the middle term will tell us what figure a categorical syllogism is on. So he says that the second figure can be returned to the first figure. So the clearest form, the clearest way to reason is the first figure. When you have a categorical argument on the first figure, A, B, B, C, you can just look at it and work out what the conclusion is going to be. When you look at the other figures, working out the conclusion is not as straightforward. So what the logicians, they do is they return each of the other figures to the first figure through the process of propositional conversion. And this is one of the reasons why propositional conversion is an important topic in a study of logic. So what do? We convert the second the second premise. What's the conversion? Conversion, if you remember, is you switch the subject and predicate while maintaining truth and maintaining quality. You keep the affirmation or negation the same. So what you do is, in the second figure, you switch CB to BC, and when you do that, it looks just like the first figure. And so if you want to figure out what the conclusion of a particular mode of the second figure is going to be, you can just apply propositional conversion to the major premise, the second one, and transform the argument into an argument on the first figure, and then you can easily figure out what the conclusion is going to be. With the third figure, you can do the same thing, except you convert, instead of converting the second premise, the major premise, you convert the first premise, the minor premise. When you switch the location of the terms of the minor premise, it becomes A, B, B, C, just like the terms on the first figure. And so you have an argument on the third figure, you apply the process of conversion, and then you can work out what the conclusion is going to be. With the fourth figure, you convert both premises, because it's a complete reverse of the first figure. So the fourth figure returns to the first figure by reversing the by reversing the order, or through conversion of both premises. So what I illustrated was conversion of both premises, but you can also reverse the order by simply putting, so if you looked at the original form, it was BACB. If you put the second one first and the first one second, you get CB, BA, and just call CA and call A C, and it becomes on the first figure. So all of these figures, second, third, and fourth figures, can be returned to the first figure. Why do we want to return them to the first figure? He says because the figure that concludes most completely and most clearly is the first figure. What does it mean for it to conclude most clearly? What that means is that when you look at the two premises of a categorical syllogism of the first figure, you can easily work out the conclusion. And so since it concludes most clearly, that's why we want to return each of the other figures to the first figure. So the figure that concludes most clearly is the first figure. And the second, third, and fourth figures follow the first figure in clarity, meaning that the second most clear, the figure that concludes most clearly after the first figure is the second figure, and then the third, and then the fourth. That's why he says that the fourth figure is extremely unnatural to reason with. You can try it out. You can make a syllogism on the fourth figure, make the middle term the subject of the minor premise and the predicate of the major premise, and you'll find it's quite difficult to work out what the conclusion should be and whether or not there is a conclusion. That's why the scholars they mention that in the Quran there are examples of arguments on the first figure, there are examples of arguments on the second figure, there are examples of arguments on the third figure, but there's no example of any argument on the fourth figure. He says the fourth figure is extremely unnatural to reason with. He says someone with a sound nature and intellect will not need to return the second figure to the first. So the logicians, they disagree. They say that they disagree regarding whether it is possible to figure out the conclusion of the second, third, and fourth figures without returning it to the first, whether or not this is possible. And the disagreement is strongest with the second figure, and the dominant position amongst the logicians, the later logicians, is that second figure you can actually work out its conclusion without having to return it to the first figure, but with the third you do need to return it to the first figure. So what's an example of a syllogism of the second figure, of a categorical argument on the second figure? Here's an example. All humans are animals. No boulders are animals. You can easily figure out the conclusion. If every single human being is an animal, and there is no boulder that is an animal, then it follows that no humans are boulders. No A is C. So this is an example of an argument on the second figure, because the two premises, their common term, the middle term, is at the end, A, B, C, B, and it's an example of an argument on the second figure that has a conclusion, and we can work out the conclusion without having to return it to the first figure. That's why Abhari says that someone with a sound nature and intellect will not need to return the second figure to the first. Sound nature and intellect means that's this either naturally or through training. So many of us, we don't have because we haven't gone through the process of learning logic formally, we might get confused. But if you practice for a while and you understand how a categorical syllogism works and how the reasoning works, then you can turn your nature and intellect into a sound nature and intellect and work out the conclusion yourself. He says the figure that concludes most completely and most clearly. So we did this line already, but we skipped the meaning of the first figure concluding most completely. We know what it means for it to conclude most clearly. We just explained that. But what does it mean for it to conclude most completely? In order to do that, we need to consider the 16 modes of the first figure. Every figure, each one of the four figures is going to have 16 modes. The way that you figure out the modes, the 16 modes, is that you have two premises, the minor and the major premise. Now, the minor premise could have one of two qualities. It could be affirmative or negative. That's two possibilities. For each of these two possibilities, it could be universally quantified or particularly quantified. So the quantity of the minor premise, there's two possible. So that's 2 times 2, 4 possibilities. For each of these 4 possibilities, the major premise could be affirmative or negative. That's 4 times 2, 8. And for each of these 8 possibilities, the quantity of the major premise could be universal quantification or particular quantification. That makes 16 different modes. Every figure has 16 different modes. We're going to look at the modes of the first figure very shortly, and we'll see shortly that there's only some of the modes conclude. Not all the modes of the first figure, nor all of the modes of the other figures conclude. And the modes of the first figure that conclude, that have a valid conclusion, are these 4 modes. And these 4 modes, if you look at them, the conclusion of the first of these 4 modes is affirmative and universally quantified. All A is C. Okay. The conclusion of the second concluding mode is negative and universally quantified. No A is C. The conclusion of the third concluding mode is affirmative and particularly quantified. Some A is C. And the conclusion of the fourth concluding mode is negative and particularly quantified. Some A is not C. And so you have, it concludes, so you have a conclusion of every kind. You have a conclusion, you have negative conclusions, and you have affirmative conclusions. And for the negative conclusions, you have a universally quantified negative conclusion and a particularly quantified negative conclusion. And for the affirmative conclusion, you have a universally quantified affirmative conclusion and a negatively quantified and a particularly quantified affirmative conclusion. And so you have all 4 kinds of conclusions. Only the first mode gives you all 4 kinds of conclusions. The other modes will only give you some of these kinds. That's what Athiruddin al-Abhari meant when he said that it concludes most completely, because he meant that it gives you the most kinds of conclusions. So when does the second figure conclude? He says that the second figure only concludes when its premises differ in affirmation and negation. So we just saw that every figure has 16 modes, and not all of those modes conclude. So the logicians, they looked at the second figure, and we just saw that you can actually work out the conclusion of the second figure by looking at it carefully. So he said the second figure only concludes when its premises differ in affirmation and negation, meaning if the major premise is affirmative, then in order for the second figure to conclude, the minor premise needs to be affirmative, and vice versa. They need to differ in affirmation and negation. There's another condition which Abhari didn't mention, namely that the major premise must be universally quantified. And so if we apply these 2 conditions, let's look at the 16 modes of the second figure. Note that this is on the second figure because B, the middle term, is the predicate in both the minor and major premises. So these 8 modes, they differ in quality, meaning that one of the minor and major premises is affirmative and the other is negative. So this is the first condition. The second condition was that the major premise must be universally quantified, and that eliminates 4 of the possibilities, and we're left with these 4 modes. So these are the 4 modes of the second figure that give you a conclusion, and you can work out the conclusion very easily. The rule is that if you know that a particular mode of any of the 4 figures concludes, then what you look for is the if one of them is negative, you put the conclusion is going to be negative. And if one of them is particularly quantified, then the conclusion is going to be particularly quantified. So the conclusion takes the worst quality. The worst quality is negation. Negation is worse than affirmation. And it takes the worst quantity. The worst quantity is particular quantification. That's worse than universal quantification. And with that, you can work out each of the first four conclusions. So in the first case, you get the negative quality from the major premise, but it stays universally quantified because both of them are universally quantified. In the second case, you get the particular quantification from the minor premise and the negation from the major premise, and so the conclusion is sum A is not C. It's particularly quantified and negative. In the third case, you get the negation from the first premise, minor premise, and both are universally quantified, so it stays universally quantified. No A is C. And in the third case, you get the first is particular and particularly quantified and negative, and so both of these characteristics carry through to the conclusion, and none of the other modes conclude. What does it mean they don't conclude? It means that they do not formally conclude. Some of these non-concluding modes may actually have a conclusion if you look at the specific subject, predicate, and of each subject and predicate of each proposition. But if you look purely at the form and you abstract away what the particular subjects and predicates are, then the formal entailment only exists in the four modes that we've just described. The remaining modes, they don't have a formal entailment, meaning that you can think of some subjects and predicates with which they have one kind of conclusion, and you can think of other subjects and predicates with which they have another kind of conclusion. So the entailment, if there will be any entailment, will be connected with the subject matter of the subject and the predicates, not with the form of the argument. And what we're interested in here is formal logic, the form of the argument. After giving a rule of thumb to identify the concluding modes of the second figure of the categorical syllogism, Athiruddin al-Abhari tells us in detail the concluding modes of the first figure. Why focused on the first figure? He says the first figure is the criterion for the knowledge of all conclusions. What it means for it to be the criterion for the knowledge of all conclusions is that any syllogism on the second, third, or fourth figures can be returned through a transformation by conversion, as we saw earlier in this lesson, can be returned thereby to the first figure. And then, after returning it to the first figure, you work out what the conclusion is, if there is any conclusion. So, because we are going to return any argument on the other three figures to the first figure is the criterion for the knowledge of all conclusions, regardless of the figure of the syllogism. He says the first figure is the criterion for the knowledge of all conclusions, so we will describe it in order for it to be a reference from which the details of other figures can be concluded. When does the first figure conclude? He gives us a rule of thumb. He says the condition of its having a conclusion is that the minor premise be affirmative and the major premise be universally quantified. Keep these two things in mind. Minor premise must be affirmative and major premise must be universally quantified. So if we look at the 16 modes of the first figure, minor premise must be affirmative. That gives us these 8 modes. In all of these 8 modes, the minor premise is affirmative. Either all A is B or some A is B. That's the first condition. The second condition is that the major premise must be universally quantified. That eliminates 4 and leaves us with these 4, in which the major premise is universally quantified. Either all B is C or no B is C. So he tells us that these are the 4 concluding modes of the first figure. We can work out the conclusions by looking at the minor and major premises. Whenever you see a negation, it makes its way into the conclusion, and whenever you see a particular quantification, it makes its way into the conclusion, and we get the four conclusions that we saw briefly earlier in this lesson. And we saw that you have one conclusion for each possible kind of quantity, propositional quantity and propositional quality. Now, talking about A's and B's and C's can be quite abstract, and for beginners it can prevent them from seeing the significance of what's being said. And so Athiruddin al-Abhari gives us specific examples with specific subjects and specific predicates for each of these four concluding modes. And so he says, and we'll take his text and put it onto the table that we just saw. He says it has four concluding modes. The first one is, he gives an example. He says every corporeal body is composed. A corporeal body is a body that occupies space. It takes up space, physical, something physical. Every physical body, every physical thing that exists is composed, except the thing from which it is composed. What is the thing from which it is composed? That's a long philosophical debate in medieval metaphysics, Aristotelian and Islamic, and modern science has its own input on this. We won't get into the details of that, but for now, we want to just take some example, and the point is to focus on the form and not on the content. But as an illustrative example, he says, he gives this argument is actually taken from, it's one of the many arguments in the traditional books of Kalam. It's probably not the best argument, but it is one of the arguments, and it is a valid argument. We'll see that in a course on Kalam later. So, but the argument here says that anything that occupies space is composed, and anything that is composed must have been made by something else. Something must have made it composed, and something must have made it exist after not having existed. So he says that every corporeal body is composed. This is all A is B. This is the minor premise. A is everything that's corporeal, every corporeal body, and B is something that is composed. The major premise, all B is C. Everything that is composed is created. This gives the conclusion all A is C. Therefore, every corporeal body is created. He gives and now he's going to take the same argument and he's going to change from created. He's going to talk about things being beginningless. Beginningless is something is beginningless qadim when it's not created. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is beginningless. He did not begin to exist, and the universe is all created, which means that its existence was preceded by non-existence. So we can take the same argument and say that every corporeal body is composed. Nothing that is composed is beginningless. All A is B, no B is C, therefore no corporeal body is beginningless. No A is C. No corporeal body is beginningless. That's why one of the philosophical reasons for why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not occupy space, and it's actually one of the meanings of the famous surah of the Quran, Surah Al-Ikhlas, the first verse, Qul huwallahu ahad. Say, the great matter is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is absolutely one, utterly one, so one and single that He's not even composed. He's not something that is composed or could be composed. So he says so this is the second variation. The third variation is some corporeal body is composed. Everything that is composed is created. Some A is B, all B is C. This gives the conclusion that some corporeal body is created. Some A is C. And finally, some corporeal body is composed. Nothing that is composed is beginningless. Therefore, some corporeal body is not beginningless. Some A is B, no B is C. The conclusion is some A is not C. So these are the four concluding modes. The other modes do not conclude. What it means for them not to conclude is that from their mere form, you cannot get any conclusion. So from their mere form, you will have certain cases, certain particular subjects and particular predicates that will give one conclusion, and other particular subjects and particular predicates that will give another conclusion, and other particular subjects and predicates that might not give any conclusion. So so the rest of the modes do not formally conclude. So we've looked at the concluding modes of the first figure. We've looked at the concluding modes of the second figure. The concluding modes of the third figure is for you to work out. You need to actually try to do it yourself to get an idea of what's going on. If I just give you the answer, you'll see it from a distance, but you won't really appreciate it. So I want you to actually work this out, and our teaching assistant will help give you feedback on your answers. And the fourth figure, because it's so unnatural, we just ignore it. We won't work with the fourth figure. And the fourth figure was in fact excluded as one of the figures by a number of early logicians such as Ghazali and Al-Farabi and others, because it's so unnatural, and the later logicians only included it for the sake of completeness. So what we just saw was the process of deductive inference with categorical syllogisms when they are composed of categorical propositions. All of the examples we saw, the propositions, the premises were categorical propositions. A categorical syllogism can surprisingly also be made with conditional propositions. How is that? That's what we're going to do in the second part of this lesson. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والله سبحانه وتعالى أعلم وهو حسبنا ونعم الوكيل.